Hello everyone, and thank you for joining me today. In this video, I want to talk about the books I read in the past 3 months. So this is going to be my wrap-up for November, December, and January. That's 16 books, so it feels like quite a lot of books, but also I feel like I've been in kind of a slump these past months and I'm still not out of it. So considering that, I feel like I read a decent amount of books. So I'm gonna start with the ones I finished last because those are, I guess, freshest in my mind. So let's see how much I can remember of the books I read in November. But the first one, or the last one I finished was Passing by Nella Larsen. I've been meaning to read this ever since the movie came out, and I'm happy I did it. It's such a short book, but unfortunately for some reason it took me such a long time to finish this. I think over a month. And I don't know why, but I think maybe it has to do with the fragmented writing style and the narrative. So this tells the story of two women who can pass as white. One of them chooses to do so and the other one doesn't. They are childhood friends and they meet again later when they both have families and children. And this is about how they re-encounter each other and they meet like every other year or something like that. But it is like, it spans, the narrative spans a few years. It's not meant to give you everything on a plate. This is something that leaves space for thinking and to draw your own conclusions. And the race question is there in the background as a framework for this novel, but this focuses mainly on these two women's identities and how they deal with the world, with each other, with their communities from the perspective of who they are and from the perspective of them being able to identify or to pass as white. The ending really surprised me. I did not see it coming at all, but I think now looking back and thinking about it, it does make sense. Next one I finished is The Winter Palace by Eva Stachniak. This is a historical fiction novel which is about the rise to power of Catherine the Great. It is told from the perspective of this woman servant / spy who has been living at the Winter Palace together with the royal family. So I've read this in Hungarian and I'm really happy I did because it's been such a long time since I read book in my own language, and I should definitely do that more often. And I really enjoyed this novel at times. At other times it was kind of slow and dragging its feet. But overall, I think if you love historical fiction, if you love Philippa Gregory novels, if you love the HBO series The Great, then you will definitely like this one. It gives you a great overview and picture of life in 18th century Russia, around the mid 18th century. And it gives you a good insight into the life at the Winter Palace, the royal residence, and a good insight into the politics and the main actors which were present at that time at the palace. So basically our main protagonist is Barbara, and she comes from Poland. Her father was a bookbinder and they moved to the Winter Palace. And when she became an orphan, the Tsarina Elizabeth promised her father that she would take care of her, and that's why she came to the palace as a servant. Later she was introduced in the machinations and in the ways of being a spy. So she becomes the ear of the Tsarina, and later she befriends Catherine the Great before she became Catherine the Great, and she also becomes a spy for her. Throughout this novel, you see her, the main character, growing and understanding what it really means to be a spy, because she wants to, I guess, further herself in life because she doesn't have much. And she's an orphan without money, so she really wants to take care of herself and her future. But she kind of becomes trapped in this cycle of espionage. A lot of effort and a lot of detail went into writing this because it really brings the palace to life. And it's so much grittier and feels so much more real than, for example, the series The Great, which for some reason it feels much more romantic and, with the edges a bit rounded and so on and so forth. So if you love historical fiction and you love to get to know the life at the Russian palace in mid-18th century, I think this is really a great one. The next one is one I listened to, and it is The Valiant by Leslie Livingston. So this is a young adult fantasy which is set during the times of the Roman Empire, and specifically during the reign of Julius Caesar. We follow this young girl named Fallon, who is 17 and a daughter of a Celtic king. She wants to become a warrior just like her sister was, who unfortunately died some years ago during the invasion of their lands by Julius Caesar. So Julius Caesar is her mortal enemy. She ends up being taken and sold as a slave, and she ends up in Rome as a female gladiator in the gladiator house, I'm not sure the exact term, of Julius Caesar. So this book had such a great start, and I felt like, oh wow, this is an amazing young adult fantasy that I'm really gonna enjoy, that is not gonna have a lot of those young adult fantasy tropes that I kind of got tired of in these past years. But unfortunately, I was disappointed because it had some of those tropes that I really don't enjoy, like insta-love, for example. The romance in this one was completely unnecessary, in my opinion, because you have this setting of this gladiator house for women, so women gladiators. So you could really make this series or this specific first installment about the friendship between these women, and I just feel like there was a big missed opportunity there, and instead it kind of focuses on a little bit on this romance, which is, as I said, completely unnecessary, but also it kind of pits some of these women against each other, and I just feel like, why make it about the competition between these women? I don't know, but I don't think I'm going to continue with this one, and but I would love to pick up more books set during these times. I don't think that there's so many books out there, so if you know any, please let me know. I would really love to read some fantasy or just historical fiction set around this time. The next one I read is another historical fiction, and it is Juleka by Guzeli Yakina. And I have to say, I am 100% guilty of buying this book because of the cover. I think it's absolutely gorgeous. This is set after the Russian Revolution, so it is set in the 1930s, around the time of dekulakization and collectivization in Russia. We follow this young woman at the beginning. At the first part of this novel is really set in this really small Tatar village in which this woman lives in this really abusive relationship with a much older husband and a mother-in-law who is like the demon from hell. I mean, the life of this woman is just so hard. She's not appreciated at all. And you kind of get a feel like this is the kind of life you are to expect as a woman. So it either hardens you and makes you really mad and bitter like her mother-in-law is, or just makes you really broken and maybe you die young. So the first part of this book is taking place in that village, and then in the second part we follow her as she is taken to Siberia. This was a massive undertaking around that time, and all of these camps were set up in Siberia. So in the second part you kind of follow that group of people who kind of end up there. You follow more characters, so the focus is still on Juleka, but not as a main character, and you end up looking through the lives of other people in that camp. I feel like this second part takes a bit away of what this book, in my opinion, should have been, which was the life of Juleka and how she grows as a woman, how she grows into herself, how she learns to be independent in that camp. I don't feel like the title should be Juleka, actually, because it should be more about how life is and people in general in that camp. But Juleka is the appropriate title for the first part of this novel. The next one I read was Dune by Frank Herbert. And this one made it to the list of my favorite books of 2021. So if you haven't checked that video, I'll link it for you. But I'm so happy I managed to read this, because even though this was not a typical modern fantasy sci-fi book, you can really tell that this is not the recent book. But what the author did with this world and the political machinations and just the scope of this is absolutely amazing. I was fascinated by this world ever since I've seen the first Dune adaptation, which is terrible. So when I heard that the new one is coming out and in 2021, I knew that I'm going to read this. Since I have seen the movie a couple of times, and I really, really enjoy it. And this book is also one that you would enjoy if you love a good sci-fi fantasy, which is really focused on political machinations and just great world building, where there's just so many interconnected threads and so many details that you may miss on a first read. But then again, if you love fantasy sci-fi and if you love, big worlds with a lot of detail, I think you would definitely enjoy this one. You can see that this book has stood the test of time and it is still relevant today, even with its themes like religion and fanaticism and the chosen one, the trope, which is central to this book. The next one I read was Clara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro. This is his latest book and the first one he published since he won the Nobel Prize for Literature. I think he publishes the book every 5 years. So yeah, there's a little bit to wait, if that's the truth, for the next one. But over the years, he has become one of my favorite writers. And I absolutely love the narrative style, the themes he chooses for his books, and the main characters. And there's just something about his books that really breaks your heart, I think, and this is no exception. In this one, we follow Clara, who's an artificial friend, an AF, and her purpose in life is to present herself in the best way in the store where she's sold, and then become the best friend of the humans that buy her. So we follow, to the first part of this novel, for the most part, we follow her when she's in the store, and we kind of get a sense of life, of the world a little bit from her perspective, looking through the outside world, looking to the street. She has such a limited view. I mean, she doesn't know a lot about the world, but at the same time, she's really good at observing and learning. And then in the second part, she's bought and she becomes the AF of this young girl, and she comes to live in her house with this young girl, her mother, and their servant. As time passes, you get a sense of how she evolves as an AF, but you get a sense of what this world is. It's kind of like a futuristic world where technological advancements has made class divide deepen between people. The central theme of this novel is what love is. And it really looks at how we as humans look at, in a way, consumerism and what different objects mean to us. It felt like the second part dragged a bit, and you really have to wait. It's really a slow burn, and you have to wait until about 80% mark to really kind of guess where this is going, because you really are taken by surprise there. And the ending of this is just absolutely devastating. I would highly, highly recommend it, especially if you loved Never Let Me Go by Kazuo Ishiguro. I think it has somewhat similar themes. The next book I read was Fictions by Jorge Luis Borges. I picked this up for the Invisible Cities project for Argentina. And when I looked into the country, I saw that this is where you should start, especially if you love classics. What also interested me was that looking into South America and Argentina as like from a literary perspective, it is said like that's where like magical realism as a genre was born, and it's kind of like implied in a way. I don't know, my research wasn't that extensive, but it was implied that Jorge Luis Borges is kind of like the father of the genre. The way this man's brain works is just absolutely fantastic. He's one of the most well-read men I think, out there. I read somewhere. And you can really tell by reading these books because his mind works in mysterious ways. And the way he pieces together these stories and the stories he makes up and the worlds he makes up and just is just so amazing. You don't know what you're gonna get when you start these stories. You don't know whether you're gonna enjoy them. You don't know whether you're gonna understand them. You might need to reread them. But looking through them and rereading some of them is just, try to capture the essence. And maybe you won't. Maybe you will. You left in doubt. I don't know. But the way these stories are put together and the ideas in them are just absolutely fantastic. I've never encountered anything like this before. And this is from me not loving magical realism. But if all magical realism was like this, I would absolutely love them. Even though I would be like, I don't really understand what I'm reading. But I think that's the magic of magical realism, so to speak. I don't know. If you haven't read Jorge Luis Borges and you love magical realism, you love classics, and you don't mind being challenged by a book, definitely read it. Then I have the 2 books I read for Nonfiction November, so yeah, quite a while ago. But the first one I read was Quiet, The Power of Introverts in a World That Can't Stop Talking by Susan Cain. Now, I had this on my TBR ever since I've heard about this book many years ago, and I picked it up randomly at a secondhand bookstore at some point. And I thought that I'm really gonna enjoy this one. And a lot of people like it. I've seen a lot of raving reviews on Goodreads because if you're an introvert, then you will see yourself in this book and you can relate to it. So I think a lot of people give it high ratings. But for me, who has knowledge of introversion from here and there accumulated over the years, I don't feel like this has given me so much more. So I think I would recommend you to read this if you don't know a lot about introversion. And I think it would be a great introduction to the subject. I really loved the beginning in which it looked at American society and how it changed with industrialization, with moving to the cities, and how, at the beginning of the 20th century, how our lives changed basically, and how the world became much more focused on extroversion and just being loud and out there and just focused on selling yourself. Whereas maybe in the 19th century, where you lived more rurally, where you didn't have those jobs in the big cities where you had to compete and you had to be loud to get the better jobs, how then a more introvert lifestyle was more prevalent throughout. So I really love that introduction because it really put it into perspective. But then we went into these different chapters in which it focused on some examples, and then it gave you the literature and the research done in the area, and I just couldn't enjoy it as much. I don't think I liked these types of nonfiction where you gather all the research done in a specific topic, and then you present the research, and then you give an example, because it just feels the examples are not really like they're taken from different places and they just don't give you like a fluid narrative. I think there are much better nonfictions out there. I'm not sure whether they are on this topic, but overall, yeah, it was okay, but not the perfect nonfiction read for me. The next book I read is a memoir, and it is The Last Girl, My Story of Captivity and My Fight Against the Islamic State by Nadia Murad. It is actually one of my viewers here who recommended me this book, so if you're watching this, thank you. I have added this to my reading memoirs by women TBR, and I'm really happy I did so. I think this is a book and this is a story everyone should know. This is about Nadia, who comes from this really small Iraqi village, northern Iraqi village. She comes from this community and from this religious group, the Yazidis. And they have their own religion, which is passed down orally. And it is really close-knit, closed religion, basically, because you cannot convert to Yazidism. But because their religion is only passed down orally, so never written down, they are systematically killed and persecuted. In 2014, when she is 21 years old, ISIS comes and massacres her village, most of the men, and takes all the women into slavery. So in this book, she really goes deep into her community and her religion. She's really takes her time in explaining that to us. And then she goes into what happened with ISIS and then how she escaped. And then towards the end, she goes into how she's fighting ISIS and how she really fights to prevent this happening, because this systematic killing of her people is basically a genocide. And she's really raising awareness and just fighting for her people's survival because they're being massacred. And she actually won the Nobel Prize for her work. So if you haven't heard about this book, if you don't know about Yazidism, if you want to learn about stories like hers, which are so important, then you should definitely pick this book up. Next, I have listened to The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. And I picked this up quite randomly at the beginning of November, I think maybe end of October. It was kind of like a Halloween-inspired read in a way, because in 2021 I dabbled a little bit into horror, which is a genre I'm really not into and have stayed away from. But I have read a few books in 2021, and I feel like the more literary horror is something I can read and enjoy as much as you can enjoy horror, I guess. Well, I guess you can, depends on what you are into. But I really thought that I'm not into horror. Anyway, I was proven wrong in 2021, so I wanted to try something classic horror. So this is basically the story of what happens in the Hill House, which is like possessed, and how these people go there to record the interesting phenomena happening in that house. And this is the story of this central character, this woman who has taken care of her mother all of her life. And she doesn't really have her own personality almost. All she has done her entire life was taking care of her mother. So she cannot stand her on her own now that her mother is dead, and all she has is her sister and her sister family who don't really accept her for who she is. So when she goes to this house, because she experienced some supernatural paranormal phenomena growing up, she feels like she's one of the chosen ones because she's special, and she never felt special in her life. And this is about what happens to her mainly in that house, but also to the other people in that house at that time. It's such a slow build, and I listened to it and it wasn't such a scary listen either. So if you haven't read this yet and you love classics and horror, then definitely pick this up, because it wasn't as scary as I thought it's going to be. So yeah, I was pleasantly surprised, and I will definitely pick up more Shirley Jackson in the future. I decided to group these last 6 books separately here at the end of the video, so there's going to be a timestamp or something, because I've read a lot of romance. And I kind of went on a romance binge unexpectedly, because I picked up The Hating Game, which kickstarted this whole thing because of the movie which came out. And, you know, as a romance and as a book that everyone or a lot of people recommend, I just picked it up because I was curious. And I really enjoyed it. I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't have its flaws, but for a hate to love trope and romance, I think it's done so well. And of course, not looking at all the negatives which can be said about, I guess, every book, but also romance here, I really enjoyed it. And I think in romance, this hate to love trope really works for me. So that's my experience from looking at all of these other romances I picked up here. I think you have to look at the premise, and you have to look whether you would enjoy the tropes being used. So in this case, hate to love is definitely my jam. And for an office romance, contemporary romance, yeah, I mean, it worked. There were some exaggerations and some places where I rolled my eyes, but I think the romance was done really, really well. What I didn't enjoy is at the end is how the main character, the main male character, was portrayed as someone with daddy issues. I think that the book would have been much better without that. The next one I read was The Love Hypothesis by Ellie Hazelwood. I think this is kind of like a debut. I'm not sure, but this is also one of the more popular ones from 2021, in which in this academical setting, we follow this young girl who is a PhD student, and this is about her romance with a college professor. So I'm not sure if you would like this trope, but looking apart from that it's a student and professor, even though it's not her professor, some people might have issues with that. But I love the academical setting. And I love the fake dating trope, which is at the center of this one. So yeah, I've also heard good things about this, so I picked it up and I enjoyed it. I mean, it also had its issues, but overall I think the romance was really well done, and there was a good chemistry between the characters, and I also love the fake dating trope. The next romance I read was People We Meet on Vacation by Emily Henry. I picked this up because this is so popular. It was everywhere. It is everywhere. And this didn't work for me as much as the other two. I think because of the writing style. So basically we follow this couple who start out as best friends, who met in college and kept in contact for years. And they always went on these vacations together as friends. What didn't work for me is because this is going back and forth in time and is looking at particular vacations these people took, and something happened in one of these vacations and that kind of broke their friendship, and now they're trying to rekindle it after some years, and they decide to go on another vacation. So what I loved about this, even though overall it wasn't my jam, was how well they did friends to lovers. I think if this is a trope you love, I think you would definitely enjoy this one. Next, I read another Emily Henry book, and this is Beach Read. And this is such a popular one. And to be honest, now after reading it, I don't see where the hype comes from, and I don't see why this is so popular. So in this one, we follow the main characters who are both writers, and they're in this writing slump. Can you call it that? I don't know. But they both need to write something and they can't. And they just end up being neighbors in this like vacation town around this lake. And I just don't get why this is called Beach Read, because not a lot happens on a beach. And I think the title is also a bit misleading, because I was thinking about like a sandy beach. Anyway, mostly I would call this maybe a porch read. Definitely not a beach read. Anyway, I can see it in some way why people like it, but I just didn't feel like it was such a good romance story. And the whole setting of it and the whole plot and everything, it just feels like what the author also says at the end of this audiobook is that she wrote this book because she was in a slump and she couldn't write, and then she kind of built her book based on that. But I don't know, let me know if you have read it, but for me it just didn't work. Next, I have read The Honeymooners by Christina Lauren, which is again one that didn't work for me. I don't know. I just feel like the central conflict, which really starts this book and puts these two people on this path of hate to love, not like to love, is really not well done. So basically we follow these two people who are at this wedding, and everyone is sick because of food poisoning. It's only these two people who are not, and they have to go on the honeymoon instead of the actual bride and groom. And in this honeymoon, they find out that they kind of in love, and that there are all the things that happened throughout the years while they knew each other was based on this big misunderstanding. And the way that misunderstanding is set up, I just feel like for me, it didn't really work. Also, at the end, there's this whole situation, misunderstanding, and where the main male character doesn't believe the main female character for these very stupid reasons, it feels like, and it just did not work for me. But again, this is a popular one, and if you love kind of hate to love, it's not hate to love as in the hating game though. This is more like, as I said, not like to love, or misunderstood each other, and that's why we don't like each other too. Realizing we misunderstood each other and we actually like each other love story. I don't know how else to tell you, but again, one of those that really did not work for me. And the last one I want to talk about is Emerald Blaze by Ilona Andrews, and this is book 5 in the Hidden Legacy series. Yes, I'm just peeping at my notes. And book 2 in the Catalina Baylor trilogy. So in this overarching series, we follow this family, and we follow, in each trilogy, we follow one person from this family. So this is the latest release in this series, so I'm really up to date, which doesn't happen that often. But why I like this, and why I liked in the previous ones, was that this is set in this urban fantasy. This is a paranormal urban fantasy kind of world in which people have this. Some people have gotten this serum. Some time ago, this serum was developed, and because of that, some people have developed magical abilities. And then this serum, because it was so dangerous, because people abused this power, of course, this was hidden away. But these magical abilities were passed down through generations, and these big houses kind of developed, were founded based on specific family traits. And the politics of this world is that if you are born really powerful from powerful parents, you can marry into another house and then just increase your offspring's powers and abilities, and ultimately the wealth of your house. And in this novel, and in this series, we follow this family who is from this unknown house. They don't really have powers, or so they thought at the beginning, but actually they do. And they build their house, but at the same time they have this detective agency, and each book follows like a mystery or like a detective story, something, a case they have to solve. And then there's also an overarching plot line, which is also interesting to follow. So overall, if you love these kind of settings and it's really fast paced, so many things happening, so many twists and turns, combined with a good romance and good, I think, it's so well done from the point of view of romance as well, that you would definitely enjoy it if you love those two things together. And overall, I enjoyed all of this series. I think, though, this is the weakest installment of this series, but I will definitely continue reading this. So I think I'm done talking about the books I read. I'm not sure if I missed any. I don't think I did. No, I haven't missed any. Oh God, amazing. Because I felt that like there must be something I missed, but thank God for my notes. So I guess these are all the books I read in these past 3 months. A lot of romance. So I think I'm good for romance for a while. But I do feel the need to pick up more fantasy. I don't know. I'm just in the mood. But moving forward, I will definitely focus on reading the books from my shelves, and especially the books from my previous video, which was about all the unread fiction I have on my physical shelves. That is the biggest project for me in 2022. So I think in February I will mostly focus on reading some books from there, but also I have some ongoing from previous TBRs which I haven't cleared from my shelves, from my TBR shelves. Anyway, going off into tangents here. Let me know if you have read anything exciting that you would recommend in this past month or so. And I guess this is where I will leave you. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Goodbye.